going back to McAndrew. A lady traveler, Liza's terrible end and the murder of Maria Lebyadkin really overwhelmed Shatov. As I mentioned before, I ran into him that morning and he didn't seem himself to me. By the way, he told me then that the evening before, around 9, that is, about 3 hours before the outbreak of the fires, he had been to see Maria Lebyadkin. In the morning, he went to have a look at the bodies of the victims, but as far as I know, he made no statement to the police then. By the end of the day, however, his soul was in turmoil, and I think I can safely say that by dusk, he was on the point of going and telling everything. He was the only one who could say what that everything was, but there is no doubt that he would have achieved nothing beyond drawing suspicion down on himself. He had no evidence that could have helped to solve the newly committed crime, since he himself had only vague inklings about it that added up to complete certainty to him alone. But he was willing to give his life to see, quote, the beasts crushed, end of quote, as he put it himself. Peter had been partly correct in predicting this impulse in Shatov, and he was aware of the great risk he was taking in postponing his horrible new plan for a day. He displayed here his usual trust in his own ability to cope with any situation, and his infinite contempt for the bunch of, quote, non-entities, end of quote, with whom he was dealing. In general, and for Shatov in particular, he had long despised Shatov for his, quote, tearful imbecility, end of quote, as he used to call it when the two of them were still living abroad. And he was sure of his own ability to cope with this guileless fellow, that is, never to let him out of his sight and to intercept any dangerous moves he might make at their first inception. Actually, what saved, for a while at least, those whom Shatov called the, quote, beasts, end of quote, and whom he was longing to crush, was a circumstance that none of them had foreseen at all. Between 7 and 8 that evening, at the time that the worried members of our Local 5 were indignantly waiting for Peter at Urkel's, Shatov, his head aching and slightly feverish, was stretched out on his bed in complete darkness. He was tormented by rage and uncertainty about what to do. He felt he was on the verge of deciding but couldn't, and cursed himself. At the same time, feeling that nothing would come of it anyway. Eventually, however, he slipped into a half-sleep and had a nightmare. He saw himself lying on his bed, tied up with ropes and unable to stir, while someone was pounding on the fence, on the gate, at Kirilov's cottage in the courtyard, and at his own door, shaking the whole house. And far away, a pained, familiar voice was calling out to him. Suddenly, he awoke and sat up. To his surprise, the banging at the gate continued, and although it was not nearly as violent as it had been in his dream, it was hard enough and persistent. He also heard the familiar voice at the gate, although it wasn't plaintive as it had been in his dream, but impatient and irritated, alternating with someone else's more restrained voice. He got up, walked over to the window, and opened it. "Who's there?" he shouted, literally stiffening with fear. "If that's you, Shatov," the answer came, harsh and impatient from the gate below, "then do me a favor and state clearly and honestly whether you wish to receive me or not." No doubt about it, he recognized the voice. "Mary, is that you?" "Yes, of course it's me. Mary Shatov, and I assure you I can't keep the cabbie waiting 1 minute longer. Just a second. I'll get a candle, Shatov shouted weakly. He rushed to look for the matches. As usual in such cases, he couldn't find them. Instead, he dropped his candlestick on the floor, and at that moment the impatient voice came again from the gate. So he gave up the search and rushed downstairs like a madman to open the gate. "Do me a favor and hold this suitcase while I deal with this idiot," Mrs. Shatov said as soon as he reached the gate, thrusting a light, cheap canvas suitcase studded with brass nails at him. Then she pounced angrily on the cabbie. "I tell you, you're trying to overcharge me," she shouted at him. "If you drag me through those filthy streets for an extra hour, it's your own fault. It was you who couldn't find this stupid street in this idiotic house, so you'd better take the 30 kopeck coming to you. You won't get a kopeck more." "But ma'am, you yourself kept saying Assumption Street when we wanted Nativity Street. Assumption was miles out of our way. Look at my horse. He's steaming like anything, and all for nothing. Assumption, Nativity. You should know more about those idiotic names than I do because you happen to be a local cabbie. Besides, what you say is wrong. As soon as I hired you, I mentioned Filipov's house. And you told me you knew it. Of course, you can lodge a complaint against me if you like, but meanwhile, I demand that you leave me alone." Here's another 5 kopecks, Shatov said hurriedly, fishing a coin out of his pocket and handing it to the cabbie. "Please, don't do that, I tell you," Mrs. Shatov said, flaring up. But the cabbie touched his horse with the whip and moved off, while Shatov took her arm and drew her inside the gate. "Come, Mary, hurry up. Never mind the cabbie. Look, you're soaking wet. Careful, here. There are stairs. I'm sorry, I have no light. Watch out, the steps are steep. Hold on to me, hold on. Here's my room. I'm sorry, there's no light. One moment." He picked up the candlestick he had dropped, but it took him a long time to find the matches. Mrs. Shatov waited, standing motionless in the middle of the room. "Ah, thank God, here they are," he cried joyfully, lighting the candle. Mary looked quickly around the room. "I'd been told you lived very poorly, but I never expected it to be this bad," she said with distaste, moving toward the bed. "Ah, I'm tired." She sat down on the bed, looking completely exhausted. "Well, put my suitcase down and sit on that chair, please." "All right, please yourself, but it tires my eyes to have you standing up like that." "I'll have to stay with you here until I find a job because I know nothing about this town and have no money. But if my presence inconveniences you, please say so now. That's the only honest thing you can do. In fact, it's your duty. I suppose I could sell something tomorrow and pay for a hotel room. Only, in that case, I'll have to ask you to take me to the hotel. Oh, but I'm so tired." Shatov began to tremble. "No, Mary, why go to a hotel? What hotel? Why? His voice sounded imploring. His hands were clasped. "If I don't go to a hotel, I'll have to explain a few things to you. I suppose you remember, Shatov, that you and I spent a little over 2 weeks as husband and wife in Geneva, after which we parted without quarreling, however, roughly 3 years ago? Now, I don't want you to think that I've come back to resume our former stupid relationship. I've come here to look for a job. And if I picked this particular town, it was because it makes no difference to me where I live. I certainly haven't come to make up for anything, and you'll oblige me by not assuming any such nonsense." "Oh, Mary, you don't have to say, you didn't have to," Shatov mumbled indistinctly. "Well, if that's the way you feel, if you happen to be sufficiently civilized to understand the situation, I'll take the liberty of adding that I turned to you in the first place and came directly to your address because I never considered you to be a despicable person. In fact, you're probably much better than those other good-for-nothings, really." Her eyes flashed. Probably she had suffered a great deal from those, quote, "other good-for-nothings," end of quote. "And please believe me, I wasn't laughing at you just now when I said I thought you were a decent fellow. I said plainly what I feel. without using big phrases, which I can't stand. But all that is neither here nor there. I was always sure that you'd be intelligent enough not to pester me. Ah, that's enough. I'm too tired, really. She gave him a long, tired, harassed look. Shatov stood by the wall opposite the bed, about 5 paces from her. He listened shyly as she spoke, but there was a perceptible change in his face, some new life, a strange sort of radiance. This strong, uncouth man who usually presented a bristling exterior to the world suddenly mellowed and lighted up. Something unusual and unexpected stirred in his heart. 3 years of separation and a broken marriage hadn't displaced anything in his heart. I think that's a fantastic little tiny paragraph because it shows that Shatov was someone that was truly in love. Didn't have anything to do with convenience or money or even a man and a woman that got along with each other. He was just in love with this woman, and she just lit him up. For whatever reason, people fall in love, and love is not always convenient, and obviously Shatov had not found a convenient love. And now I'm going to go to Pavel Velikonskiy. I cannot in Pavel Velikonskiy find this particular moment. Did I find it in Magarshak? I'm sorry. I can't even remember. I can't even remember what fucking paragraph it was. Shatov stood by the wall opposite the bed. This is back to McAndrew. About 5 paces from her. He listened shyly as she spoke, but there was a perceptible change in his face, some new life, a strange sort of radiance. This strong, uncouth man who usually presented a bristling exterior to the world suddenly mellowed and lighted up. Something unusual and unexpected stirred in his heart. 3 years of separation and a broken marriage hadn't displaced anything in his heart. I've got to see if I can find that in the other books. Hold on. I wasn't laughing at you when I said I thought you were a decent fellow. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Okay. Here's Pavir Velikonski, that same paragraph. But the thing is, on this one, it goes for a full 2 pages, so it's not just a paragraph. That's why I couldn't find it. And she gave him a long, worn-out, tired look. Shatov stood facing her across the room 5 steps away and listened to her timidly, but somehow in a renewed way, with some never-seen radiance in his face. This strong and rough man, his fur permanently bristling, was suddenly all softness and brightness. Something unusual, altogether unexpected, trembled in his soul. 3 years of separation, 3 years of broken marriage had dislodged nothing from his heart. And now they continue on, although McAndrew, that was the end of a paragraph. And perhaps every day of those 3 years he had dreamed of her, the dear being who had once said to him, "I love you." Knowing Shatov, I can say for certain that he could never have admitted in himself even the dream that some woman might say, "I love you" to him. He was wildly chaste and modest, considered himself terribly ugly, hated his face and his character, compared himself with some monster who was fit only to be taken around and exhibited at fairs. As a consequence of all that, he placed honesty above all things and gave himself up to his convictions to the point of fanaticism, was gloomy, proud, irascible, and unloquacious. But now, this sole being who had loved him for 2 weeks, he always believed that, a being he had always regarded as immeasurably above him, despite his perfectly sober understanding of her errors, a being to whom he could forgive everything, there could have been no question of that, but even somewhat the opposite, so that in his view it came out that he himself was guilty before her for everything. This woman, this Maria Shatov, was again suddenly in his house, was again before him. This was almost impossible to comprehend. He was so struck. This event contained for him so much of something fearsome, and together with it so much happiness, that of course he could not, and perhaps did not wish to, was afraid to, recover his senses. This was a dream. But when she gave him that worn-out look, he suddenly understood that this so beloved being was suffering, had perhaps been offended. His heart sank. He studied her features with pain. The luster of first youth had long since disappeared from this tired face. True, she was still good-looking, in his eyes a beauty as before. In reality, she was a woman of about 25, of rather strong build, taller than average, taller than Shatov, with dark blonde fluffy hair, a pale oval face, and big dark eyes, now shining with a feverish glint. But the former thoughtless, naive, and simple-hearted energy, so familiar to him, had given place in her to sullen irritability, disappointment, cynicism, as it were, to which she was not yet accustomed, and which was a burden to her. But above all, she was ill. He could see that clearly. Despite all his fear before her, he suddenly went up to her and took her by both hands. "Marie, you know, perhaps you're very tired. For God's sake, don't be angry. If you'd accept, for instance, some tea at least, eh? Tea is very fortifying, eh? If you'd accept." "Why ask me to accept? Of course I accept. What a child you are still. Give it if you can. God, what a small room. How cold it is. Oh, right away, firewood. I have some firewood." Shatov got all stirred up. "Firewood, that is, but tea, too, right away." He waved his hand as if with desperate resolution and grabbed his cap. "You're going out? So there's no tea in this house." There will be everything right away. He grabbed the revolver from the shelf. "I'll sell this revolver now, or pawn it. How stupid. And it'll take so long. Here, take my money. If you have nothing, there's 80 kopecks, I think. That's all. It's like a crazy house here.